and we'll give it about another minute, and then Dave, I will start the webinar, and then you can kind of, go when you feel ready. And I think did we just get Manuel? Let's see another individual.
No, that's my research manager, Donovan.
Okay, perfect, no worries. All right, starting webinar now.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you. We'll just let the room fill up a little bit more, and then we'll get started. Good. All right. Well, welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is David Lesher. I'm the editor at Cal Matters. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan statewide news organization. We're based in Sacramento and launched about 6 years ago with a mission to raise public awareness about all of the major issues facing California. So this event is a part of a series Cal Matters is co-hosting with the Milken Institute about the future of work. And today we're going to talk about the California economy and how it's recovering from the shock of the pandemic. It's hard to overstate this profound moment in history for so many reasons. But when it comes to the economy, it's pretty clear there's major change underway, and we are still a long ways from what a new normal might look like. But this is a real good opportunity to check in and discuss what we're seeing today. So your host from Cal Matters and your moderator today will be Grace Getty. Grace is the former editor of the Washington Monthly magazine in Washington, D.C., and now she covers the California economy at Cal Matters. We're committed at Cal Matters to being a trusted source of information on these and many other issues. So I really encourage you to visit us at calmatters.org. To subscribe to our daily newsletter, and really to help support this free source of quality information by making a donation. Finally, I want to thank a tremendous group of panelists. I'm really looking forward to this important discussion today. Grace will introduce them in a moment. And I want to thank our co-hosts at the Milken Institute. And now I'd like to introduce our co-host, Matt Horton, who's the director of the Milken Institute's California Center.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks to you and your team for a wonderful series this year around the future of work, and we look forward to seeing what we can cook up for 2022. The Milken Institute, for those that aren't familiar, is also a nonprofit, nonpartisan economic policy think tank. We have offices kind of scattered about the US and the world, but we are based in Santa Monica. And our Center for Regional Economics looks at a number of issues related to city and urban economics and regional performance and housing and infrastructure and workforce. And setting the stage for today is, and as we all know, COVID-19 has upended the traditional work and education systems while accelerating and exacerbating long existing gaps and the underlying inequalities in California's economic landscape, and really exposing kind of the magnitude of the differences afforded among demographic groups and their economic safety nets, really affecting their abilities to acquire skill, access opportunities, and achieve upward mobility. Now, with new variants uprising, it's hard to see really the end of a post or the beginning of a post-COVID recovery. But as we see employment in much of the United States recovering somewhat from the fallout immediate thereof of COVID-19, California continues to lag behind in terms of other national recovery efforts. Many employers facing and the state struggling to address some of these gaps and issues in terms of unemployment claims and and the variance between the national averages. And looking towards what we can do here, we're really excited for this session to dive deep into what state employers need, what state workers need in order to meet some of these needs, where they are, and what the state leaders can do in terms of bracing for a more robust workforce as we get more into this future of work recovery conversation. So as Dave said, thanks again for letting us host this and be here today. And I'd like to turn it over to Grace Getty to introduce our panelists and get started here. Thanks again, Grace.
Great, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Dave, and thank you to all of you all who showed up for this event today. I think it's gonna be great. As Dave mentioned, I'm a reporter at Cal Matters. I cover California's economy, and I'll be moderating this event. So why are we here today? California has dug itself out of the deepest depths of pandemic job loss, but the economic effects of the pandemic are far from over. The national unemployment rate is low again at about 4.6%, but California's is far higher. It's currently tied for the highest rate in the country at 7.3%. And we're seeing other changes too. Traditionally, low wage jobs are seeing wage gains that outpace other private sector workers. Many businesses are reporting that they're having a hard time filling open positions and getting the supplies they need. And many office workers are still working from home. So today, I'll be asking panelists to discuss where California is at in its economic recovery. What is the situation like for businesses and workers? What can we expect to see in terms of economic recovery in the next 6 months or so? What structural changes has the pandemic caused in California's economy? And what lessons should we be taking from this experience to prepare for future economic shocks? In the second half of this event, I'll be opening it up to audience questions. So start thinking about questions you might have for our panelists and feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. And now I'm going to introduce our panelists. So today I am joined by Samjita Mitra, who is the chief economist with California's Department of Finance, Julian Canetti, president and CEO of California Hispanic Chambers of Commerce, Manuel Pastor, a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at USC, and also the director of USC's Equity Research Institute, and Rain Free, founder and CEO of Red Door Catering, a catering company based in Oakland, California. Thank you all so much for joining us. So I'm going to start with a question for Samjita, Manuel, and Julian, and then after that, Rain, I'd like to turn to you and ask you about what your business has been through during the pandemic. So the first question I have is, why do you think California is lagging behind the rest of the country in its recovery when it comes to the unemployment rate? And Samjita, I'd like to start with you, and then we'll go to Julian and Manuel.
Sure. Thank you, Grace. One of the reasons I think is California traditionally has had a little bit of a higher unemployment rate historically than the rest of the country, about 2.5% higher than the rest of the country. And so, in terms of that, I think our recovery, we still have a little bit more ways to go to be where we are normally historically compared to the rest of the country. But I think one of the reasons we're lagging is that we actually had, we were hit much harder by the pandemic than the rest of the US. And we had a historic high unemployment rate of 16% just a few months ago. And although we've fallen from that rate to about half of where we were, we still have a little bit more ways to go. And I think that's one of the main reasons right now that we're seeing, and there's still a little bit of uncertainty about what's going to happen with the variants. I feel like we just kind of got past the Delta variant and we now have the Omicron variant getting introduced, and there's still a lot of uncertainty. Although there's a lot of optimism about the recovery, we still are balancing that with a lot of the uncertainties that people have.
Great. Julian, do you want to take a stab at that question?
Sure. I think traditionally California, like Samjita said, traditionally has a little bit higher unemployment rate overall in the nation. But, we also have certain pockets in the state that really have huge high numbers of unemployment. When you talk about the rural areas of Southeastern California and even the Central Valley, And I think that, some of those areas we're still seeing some issues in getting those numbers down as well. But I also think you have a number of factors going on in regards to, just the unemployment benefits period that people are having. I mean, people are wanting to stay on unemployment because they're making good pay there. So I think that's an unintended consequence of what policymakers did, that was to help people recover in this, has also given us this problem with them getting back into the workforce as well.
Great. And then Manuel?
Yeah, so I just add a couple things to that. One is it's important to understand the historic experience that everyone's talking about, but also the fact that California has an economy that's been quite reliant on tourism, on entertainment, on a variety of different services. And obviously, tourism was sharply curtailed by COVID. For a while, at least, first 9 months to a year, most of the entertainment industry in terms of production was sharply curtailed as well. And it has significant ripple effects throughout the economy. We would be remiss if we did not talk also about the disparities in the unemployment experience. If you look at the data, particularly over the first 12 months of COVID, the three groups that were the most likely to be hit the hardest by disemployment were Black workers, women workers, and young workers. That's caused a significant crisis in the Black community. I can go back and talk about the Latino community a little bit in a minute. It was a significant problem for women workers, partly because of the issues of childcare and kids coming home from schools and the way in which those responsibilities are often unevenly divided within families. And I think also one thing that's really important is the impact on young workers. There's a lot of research which suggests to us that when young workers experience disemployment early in their careers, that it has a lasting effect on their career trajectory and wage earnings over time. So that's been a pretty significant impact for workers under the age of 25 who tended to be concentrated in a lot of the service industries that got shut down, and it will have an impact on them going forward. And I think it's also quite significant that for millennial workers, they experienced both the shock of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and then this second shock of COVID. And that's going to create a lot of problems for that cohort as they continue to move through the economy.
Great, thank you. Rain, I want to turn towards you and what your business has been working on. So you run Red Door Catering in Oakland. You've been in business for about 16 years, catering corporate events, weddings, and more. Before the pandemic, you had more than 50 employees, and now you have about 10. I know that when the pandemic shut down and a lot of large in-person events went away, that's the bread and butter of many catering businesses. And so you shifted to preparing meals for local nonprofits. Can you tell me a little bit about how staffing is going for you now? And if you're trying to hire, how is that going?
So staffing right now is a challenge. There's several different challenges, as said by Julian earlier, as far as the unemployment. A lot of our workers were on-call part-time staff, and which they qualified for unemployment. So it was been more beneficial for them not to work and to collect unemployment and stay home. But that isn't the entire issue. You know, childcare is a huge thing. Working, having your children at home for school, distant learning. Distant learning. That was a lot that people had to manage. Also, people were afraid. You know, they were afraid to be exposed. We're working with the community, even though if you're vaccinated, you're still exposed. So you can't push people to work and to put themselves in that environment. And so I'm very sensitive to that. But also a lot of people that were in my industry, they decided to either one, start their own business, right? If they had a skill set or a talent, they started to produce at home, some through the cottage laws, so they could cook at home. And others just went into different industries because, quite frankly, you're afraid, like if our industry was hit so hard, continuing to commit to an industry like that, not knowing if you'll have a job the next day, that's frightening. So yes, we are having a challenge recruiting talent, but also too, I am a little slow to go full-fledged again because I don't know, I still haven't received a ton of funding. It's still areas that I need support in, and I just need to take it slow and be a little bit more conservative.
Great. And Samjita, I'll definitely turn back to your follow-up question in one moment. I'm going to ask Rain one more question and then pivot to you. Rain, I'm wondering, have you had to change your business model or the services you offer in any way to kind of adjust for those, like the smaller staff size you have now?
Right. Yeah. So many of the staff, what I decided to do, the core team that we had in place, we basically looked at all the responsibility and kind of doubled them up. And so I couldn't afford to double their salary, but we did give more in compensation because they were taking on more. I myself am taking on 3 roles, and we had to shift to a lot of virtual catering, which was huge on the technical side that I did not have in place. And it was quite expensive to put things in place quickly. Also dealing with all this packaging. I don't see a lot of people talking about it, but all of the packaging and delivery is creating another problem, which is landfill waste, right? So we were trying to find solutions to have compostable packaging so that we could still service our clients. Shifting to being flexible is allowing our staff to work from home, a lot of the staff, but also giving the kitchen staff time to be with their family, like 1 week on, 1 week off. So it was a lot of moving parts that we had to quickly learn, and while everyone else was doing it. So we had our direct competitors before, and it totally increased because everyone is like scrambling to put things in place and to make it work because we just want to service our customers. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then Samjita, I think you had, you wanted to kind of bounce off of Manuel's point in the previous question.
Thank you. Well, Manuel, Julian, and Rain, all 3 of you actually. So I did want to say, so California ended its extended unemployment benefits at the beginning of September, but before that, about half the states ended in June. So we had a few months of data to look at, and we didn't see a lot of job growth in the states that ended their extended benefits earlier. As a metric that we could bounce off of. And then in September, when we ended, we also didn't see a huge spike in people rejoining the labor force to collect unemployment and look for work. That was one of the requirements that ended with the extended benefits. So you didn't, before that, you could collect unemployment and not necessarily be looking for work. And so we thought a lot of people would, be safe, want to be safe, like Rain mentioned, and stay home and collect those benefits. But when that ended, we still have 400,000 people, fewer people in the labor force now than we did in February 2020. And we're also seeing a lot of job growth in those low wage sectors that would maybe benefit from those extended benefits. We're seeing leisure and hospitality has consistently been either the top or one of the top 2 or 3 industries that have regained jobs in the last few months. They had lost almost half their jobs in this 2 months when the pandemic hit. And we're still about 17% below where we used to be, but they are still regaining jobs. So we would have thought that, if the unemployment benefits were greater than what they would earn and work, that they would opt for that. But there are still jobs being added and added at greater numbers than other sectors. But like Rain mentioned, one of the big issues is childcare, lack of access to childcare. That has been a big issue, especially for parents in the labor force, as well as transportation. A lot of those low-wage workers ended up moving out of high-cost centers. As long as the pandemic was going on, it didn't make sense for people to live in Los Angeles. It didn't make sense for them to live in San Francisco. They ended up moving out of the area. And there's a lot of lack of public transportation, easily accessible transportation for people. And that also impacts their, so there's a little bit of a geographical mismatch now between where the jobs are and where the people are. And then also, so that's one of the factors that comes into play as well. And so these are the things that I think are impacting our recovery compared to the rest of the nation as well.
So the thing I would add to that, first, Sanjita is right in characterizing the fact that the red states, when they cut off unemployment insurance, did not see an increase in employment relative to the rest of the United States. And there's been no evidence of this in California since California and other blue states made that decision. Could possibly be the result of accumulated savings. But I do think that there may be something far more fundamental at foot, which is that we would not have predicted in a state that's $400 million jobs short of its employment levels in 2019, or a US economy 4 million jobs short of its employment levels in 2019, that workers would be reluctant to come back to work. And the way that the business press is writing about this, definitely from an employer's perspective, is as the Great Resignation, pointing to the reluctance of people to come back to work and pointing to very high quit rates. That is, people who have jobs who are leaving those jobs in pursuit of other things. But I actually think something far more fundamental might be going on, which you might call not the Great Resignation, but the Great Awakening. That is, after 20 months of this social disaster, people are asking, what is the meaning of work in my life? Maybe I want a little more autonomy and I want to start a business, as Rain was pointing to for some of her former employees. Maybe I want to go back to a job, not just as higher pay, but where the hours are more regular and where I feel treated with more respect. And I think that this is something very deep and very fundamental. And I think we have to be thinking about whether or not we're in a transformational moment that sets a very different terrain. The thing I always think about with this is you would not have predicted, as I said, that people would be reluctant to come back to work when you were 4 million jobs short in the nation. During the Great Depression, you would not have predicted, with 20% of the people out of work, that folks would engage in sit-down strikes, industrial unionization, and a complete recalibration of the relationship between labor and capital. And I think we might be in such a transformational moment where the Great Awakening is leading to a great rebellion, and it might lead to a great recalibration. The thing we need to be thinking about that, and we can talk more about it, is how do we help, in particular, small businesses through that transition? Amazon, big businesses, they can begin to think about higher wages, better hours, providing people more respect at work, because of the resources and the super profits to do that. What happens for smaller businesses in this transformational moment?
Great, and I definitely want to talk about the longer term structural. I see you guys both have follow-up questions or comments. I'm definitely going to get back to you with another question, and feel free to loop in your follow-ups then.
The problem with having an academic on your panel is that what question you ask, we answer what we want.
Yeah, and I definitely want to maybe in about 10 minutes pivot to what we see as, you know, happening in the future, what the structural changes coming out of this pandemic might be. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about the policy changes or the policy solutions that were kind of offered over the past 12 months and what we see in terms of their impact, what felt like it was working, what felt like it wasn't working as well. So, I mean, you know, there have been billions in federal dollars and state dollars flooding into the economy in response to this economic shock. There's the increased unemployment payments, which we've already discussed. There was the federal stimulus checks. California did its own round of stimulus checks. There were supports for different forms of supports for businesses. And so I'm curious, you know, you can each call attention to whichever element of that you want to, but I'm curious for each of you, do you think that kind of economic recovery package has worked well, has served, you know, businesses and workers? And if there's one specific kind of intervention you want to focus on, that'd be great. Julian, I'll start with you. And I believe you're muted right now.
Sure. First, you know, Professor Pastor mentioned some of this transformation and this reimagination of people, right? And I think, you know, part of what we're seeing is people are saying, hold on, if I'm working, I'm making X amount of dollars, I got to pay childcare, take the kids to school, and we've got people now that are saying, hey, I'd rather stay home with the kids, you know, and homeschool them because of what's, you know, the mask mandates or whatever it may be. And I think that's adding to this whole, you know, employment, you know, seeing the increase in employment out there. But to your question, I think, you know, the programs, you know, California did the biggest business grant program in the nation, right? And to us, you know, every little bit, and I you know, I can't speak for Rain, but, you know, I think when a business, when you operate on a tight budget and things that are impacting us, I mean, every little bit helps, right? And whether it's the $5,000, the $15,000 or the $25,000 that California Relief Grant Program did, you know, we put more money into loan programs for capital infusion. The governor did, so that, you know, more businesses could get it rather than going the traditional routes. On that point, though, I hope that continues, and it's just not a sign of this pandemic, because I think it was something that was needed and long coming over the years for small business. I think it provided a bridge for some businesses, but we still lost a lot of businesses. And it wasn't just the pandemic that hit. You know, when you hit with the wildfires in some of the areas of the state, that also has an impact on everything, on employment, on recovery, everything else. You know, it impacts our supply chain down the road. So I think I thought that the state and the governor was proactive in saying, hey, let's help small business. And I truly believe that's why Isabel Guzman ended up going to the SBA in DC and not staying here as our small business advocate. But Tara Lynn's doing great. And you know, there's more dollars coming out, you know, for micro businesses, small businesses. But my concern in regards to this recovery is that these are programs that were long coming to support the economy of California. And that I just hope that the legislators and policymakers realize that these small investments have been important to small business, but it's important to our future economic growth. And we need to continue them. And we just can't all of a sudden say, oh, you know, we're not going to do any more technical assistance programs, or, you know, we're not going to do any more contributions to the capital infusion programs at the iBank, or whatever it may be. So
I wanted to pivot a similar question over to you, Rain. I know you're also pretty tapped into, you know, colleagues, companies in the food and beverage industry. Did you benefit from any of these either state or federal programs for small businesses, or do you know of, you know, folks in your industry who did? Can you tell us a little bit about what those were like to apply for if you tried?
So I did benefit from both rounds of the PPP and also SBA loan. However, going back to submitting our information to get it forgiven for the first round, we're having a challenge now because they had a portion of it that you had to have a certain payroll percentage. A certain portion had to go towards payroll, and we couldn't get people back. So now we have to end up paying that portion back. And it really should have been forgiven because we used that money for staff, but it was for an additional increase in wages for the people that stayed. So that's one challenge. But we did benefit, and the process was not very difficult. We had things together, our paperwork in order. So I'm sorry, you have a knock on the door.
It's okay.
One program that I did apply for, which, excuse me.
Why don't, do you want me to, I've got a question for Somjita, so I'll pivot to
Okay,
that.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Somjita, maybe there's something about the economic recovery packages that you want to respond to. Another question I had for you, right, while we're just kind of still laying out what we've all experienced over the past year and a half is, how does this kind of economic shock compare to past, especially recent past economic shocks like the 2008-9 shock and the recession that happened after that? And what do those differences mean for what the recovery could look like?
Sure, that's a great question. So in terms of just how deep this shock was, like this has been the worst recession we've had since the Great Depression of the 1930s. We thought the Great Recession about 10, 15 years ago might have been the worst. No, this is far, far worse in terms of what we saw in terms of job losses, in terms of the number of unemployed. And like I said, mentioned before, like the historically highest unemployment rate we've ever had in California was just last year. But along with that, because the economy, this was an exogenous shock to the economy. There wasn't anything that was going on in the economy itself that caused this recession. Things were just going along. We were in the longest economic expansion in history at that time. All those fundamentals had remained. They were just on hold, both on the supply side and demand side. So once the economy opened back up again, things started moving. And so our recovery, if you look in terms of job recovery, non-farm employment, it's almost like a Nike shaped. We snapped back, even though we fell the furthest that we ever had in terms of other recessions. We've also snapped back the fastest. And we still have a long way to go. It's just because we were hit so much harder by this recession. But in terms of our recovery, you know, it seems we're on track with that. Of course, I can't speak for what's going to happen on the public health side. That always remains the main concern. There's a lot of uncertainties there. But I think, you know, once we're starting to see more and more people get vaccinated, get their booster shots, children are starting to get vaccinations. And once that happens on a greater level and we hit some herd immunity, I think we can slowly start putting the public health crisis behind us. And so I think there's a lot of optimism in this recovery compared to others. Maybe less so for the small business owners because they're still living in it. But as researchers on the outside, we see a lot of hope. And to touch a little bit on what Manuel had said about the Great Awakening, I like to call it the Great Optimism. People don't quit jobs if they think the economy is going to crash soon. They hold on to the jobs they have. But the fact that people are quitting and trying to find better employment, start their own businesses, move to other parts of the state, I think that shows that there's a lot of optimism that people have in terms of the recovery moving forward, which I think will ultimately benefit all of us.
Great. And for the audience members, I just want to remind folks, you can put questions in the Q&A box. I see some folks are putting questions in the chat, which is great, but it's a little bit harder for me to keep tabs on as the moderator. So if you have questions that you want to ask the panelists in the Q&A portion, if you can put it in the Q&A specific feature on Zoom, that would be really helpful. I want to talk a little bit about kind of what structural changes the pandemic has maybe caused in California's economy. A few of you have kind of hinted at this. Maybe we'll start with Manuel. I know it's kind of speculation at this point because we're not out of the woods. The pandemic is not over, but are there trends you see or workforce changes that you think might be fundamentally different as a result of the pandemic in California?
Yeah, and I'll comment on those couple things before. I'm just getting to know Rain through this process, and I like her more each time. And part because life just interrupted, and you handled that so gracefully.
Thank you.
All of you in the Bay Area, Red Door Catering, good food, good vibes, get your event catered. So I want to say a couple things about the last question, which is, I think when we look at this in retrospect, we are going to give ourselves a B+ to an A- on what we did. Where there's shortfalls in getting to certain communities, et cetera, certainly there. But if you think about what could have happened, the macroeconomic crash that could have happened, the combination of federal and state action was remarkable. And there's certain things to be celebrated, some of which Julian pointed to with regard to what needs to be continued for small businesses, but also for the first time, California deeply recognized that undocumented immigrants in the state are undocumented Californians. 70% of undocumented immigrants in the state have been in the country for more than a decade. And the number of undocumented immigrants is matched by the number of US citizen family members who live with them, plus green card holders who live with them. And the state began to deliver aid to undocumented folks and mixed status families when the federal government, at least under Trump, was refusing to do so. That is a significant sea change in policy. It's also important to realize about the last recession, which gets to the structural changes, that most recessions are macro recessions, meaning everybody's affected. Some more than others, but everybody's affected. 2008, 2009, certainly construction workers lost their jobs, manufacturing workers lost their jobs, but so did real estate agents and people who were in finance. Home prices fell, stock market collapsed, a lot of people got hurt. That's a macro recession. This last recession was a micro recession. Low-income people lost wages, lost secure employment. If you could remote work, your wages stayed about the same. Housing prices went up, stock market boomed. And the reason why the state is dealing with a big budget surplus is not because of the overall recovery of the state. It's because wealthy people cleaned up and poor people did not. And that's an important structural change. We had a lot of inequality, and now it's even more deeply baked into the system. The other two structural changes, which are important for the economy going forward, is we've moved to the balance between goods and services have shifted to goods. One of the reasons why we've got a supply chain problem is because people aren't going out to restaurants. They're buying furniture. And that's a really big change. Second or third big change, the inequality change, the goods versus services change, is remote work. And the fact that there's going to be a lot more remote work and hybrid work in the future. And I was talking to a major investor last night who was saying that every business they're investing in is dealing with the fact that workers don't want to come back to the workplace. And you think about that as a thing that you're dealing with regard to what high-skilled workers want and don't want. But it's also the case that that's going to affect all of those ancillary restaurants, dry cleaners, all of the small businesses that service those workers that are no longer going to be going to office places to work. And that's going to have really big ripple effects on industries that you don't think of as being affected by the movement toward remote work.
Great. And so I saw you just unmuted yourself. Did you want to follow on that?
Just really quickly. So one of the things you had mentioned about was the unemployment benefits, the stimulus payments, and all of that in terms of businesses and their workers. But I also wanted to talk about the Californian, the customer side of it. People with money, and we think extended benefits, yes, it's negative. It might be considered negative for, like, let's say businesses in terms of how much they can pay their employees. But in terms of the benefits to people, it's, especially low income earners, they're not saving that money. They're not investing it in the stock market. They're actually going out and spending it in the economy. And especially because of COVID, there's not a lot of entertainment options. There's not a lot of other services that they could spend. They're spending it on they're going to the grocery store. They're maybe buying a car because they have some money now that they maybe can use. And so I think we also need to think about the stimulus payments and the unemployment benefits as actually putting money in the hands of people so that they could spend it in the local economy, which ultimately benefits us as well. But it's on the other side in terms of thinking about what that looks like. And in terms of the structural changes, I think this recession has accelerated some of the trends we were seeing pre-pandemic in terms of the decline in retail trade. People are less likely to go to stores to shop for clothing. They're now on demand. You type in something you want in your app, and then maybe it comes to you within 2 hours. You don't have to fight traffic, and you don't have the retail space. So maybe in terms of structural changes, it's moving from retail stores to warehouses. And then we're also seeing this long-term sectoral decline in manufacturing. For decades, manufacturing has been one of the most important sectors for us in terms of providing middle income earnings to Californians, where they could buy a home, send their kids to college, and retire. And that's just not happening anymore. And no matter how much we try, that is gonna continue to decline. So we're seeing some of those structural changes in terms of where we're going in the future. That's gonna just be accelerated by this pandemic as well.
Julian, I see you have your hand raised. Did you want to chime in there as well?
Yeah, I think, in regards to the question on structural changes, that, we learned a lot about small business, micro businesses in California through this whole pandemic and recession, right? And I think we're going to see some changes in how we educate our businesses, how we take dollars and invest in their growth and their development, because, the professor talked a little bit about the inequalities. We saw there was huge inequalities in regards to diverse and businesses owned by people of color and minorities across the board, right? I tell everybody the little story about, the little Latino business owner. He thinks his banker is the young lady who he goes and makes his deposits with every week, right? When you say, who's your banker? And he says, well, it's Teresa. No, Teresa's a teller, and we found that a lot of our businesses didn't have these relationships. And this is what we saw in some of the delays that many of them had for the PPP loans, in applying for them and getting this paperwork done. So I think we're going to see some structural changes on how we educate our businesses, how we grow our businesses, and how we invest those dollars and what we invest them in. It's interesting that many of our businesses are going to remote now, right? They said, okay, we can make this work. And it's going to be interesting. And I don't know if Samjita has any information on it, what the vacancy rate in office space, is it increasing, or what's happening there, right? Because I'm hearing of a lot of business saying, you know what, we're going to downsize, or we're going to go to an office share space, and we're just going to have everybody work from home, and we'll meet one time a week in a shared boardroom or something. So I think you're going to see some structural changes there in occupancy in regards to commercial real estate and what's happening there. So.
Great. I'm going to ask just one or two more questions, and then I'm going to open it up to audience questions. Rain, you have your hand raised, and that's great because I was just about to ask you a question. So I'll ask it, and then feel free to answer it and say whatever you're hoping to say. I was going to ask you, you know, thinking ahead to the possibility of future economic shocks, either ongoing, you know, new strains of the coronavirus, or, you know, who knows what's coming with climate change. Are there things you're thinking about for your business about how to kind of either basically weatherproof it a little bit or stay flexible for future? Are there things you've learned, basically what I'm trying to ask, are there things you've learned from this economic shock that you think you're going to take with you in trying to be prepared for future economic shocks?
Right. Well, one takeaway that, huge takeaway that I have is that I have enough space to open it and have a shared space, to have more of a cooperative business model in order to offset and also save or put those resources in other places. Also moving to ownership, wanting to purchase my own building so I can have that as a safety net. Right now, I was at the mercy of my landlord during the pandemic. So that's one. But I wanted to, we're also getting into packaged goods because we realize that people aren't having large events and coming out to dine. So how can we service our clients where they are in a responsible way? But going back to what I was discussing before I had to jump off, in some ways, California is just starting to show up for micro and small businesses. This isn't the easiest state to do business, right? We are always hit with super high taxes, just different things that really eat at our bottom line. And one program that we applied through was the Work Share program. So I had 3 or 4 of my staff that gave up 50% of their wages, which affected the days they came in, including myself. And to this day, that's almost 2 years now, we have not received a payment. And so those are things that are not acceptable. And they are advertising all these programs to support small businesses, but we're forgotten a lot of times, and it's the workers, and the workers should be considered, but we also need strong business owners and support so that we can support our workers. So I definitely needed to add that. And also the disparity around grant funding, the restaurant relief grant, we applied for that, and it was structured to have, if you have minority status, then you were higher in the list. We applied, and a company, filed a lawsuit with the government saying that it was discrimination, which caused our applications to not be considered. So it's a lot of my direct competitors and other companies that I know received the grant funding, which was a huge help, and we did not, even though we were very high on the beginning list. So it's different things that people are still not talking about that really need to be amplified. Because if we're not strong, it's just like a family. If the parents aren't strong, then you can't support the children or the rest of the family. I'm not going to say that we don't appreciate the effort that has been done, but I just think that it needs to be looked at a little bit closer.
And Manuel, you've got your hand raised. Is there something you want to add in there?
Yeah, I wanted to first really important points that Rain just made, and one that I would add to that was bubbling up within what she was saying is the increasing interest in cooperative arrangements. And mutual aid. And it ranges from businesses, small businesses seeing their common interests to, that's pretty remarkable that several of your workers and you were willing to give up 50% of the wages to make sure that others could hang on. And you also see, I think, employers beginning to realize what a precious asset their workers are, which is the beginning of a more mutual, an economy based more on mutuality than just self-interest. Self-interest matters, but mutuality takes you in the long haul to more sustainable prosperity. That when we support each other, when we invest in each other, when we buy from each other, we actually wind up growing the economy for everyone. So I think that's a really interesting possibility right now, is not just traditional co-ops, those are important, but how do we build more cooperative and mutual attitudes into our economy going forward? The other thing I would say that we talked a little bit about in a prep call, that's actually also an important part of the current situation, is the movement from a just-in-time economy to a just-in-case economy. We saw that traditionally we stretched our supply lines and actually even stretched our workforces to the breaking point. We only hire enough employees to get through. We only put enough in the warehouses for what we need for the next day. We produced just enough to make sure that we can meet the demand that's immediately coming. And as we've seen these supply chains break, and as we've seen workers get broken over untenable work schedules, we've moved to a more just-in-case economy. And how do you store what you need just in case you might need it? How do you build in spare time for your workers just in case they need it for a time of rush? That's a very different economy. One that's a little more costly, and one where we need to figure out how we absorb those costs as a society so that our businesses can survive.
Great. And Samjita, I have one more question for you. I was looking at the UCLA Anderson economic forecast, and this is looking ahead. They were predicting an almost 4% employment growth rate in California next year. They're predicting a 3.9% employment growth rate. And I was wondering, if you could give us a little bit of context, would that be really good? Would that be kind of good? And second, do you also see that coming? I know you do. The Department of Finance does its own kind of forecasting and modeling.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So I think 4% in terms of this recession is really good. Like I said, we're gonna recover faster because we had a lot more to go. But the closer we get to our pre-pandemic levels, which was the record low unemployment rate of 4.3%, the closer we get to that, the slower we're going to go, because there's just not that much room to go. And so, I would have to see how that plays out over the next year in terms of our recovery. We did gain 18% of the US jobs that were added last month in October, which is higher than our historical share of about 12% of US jobs. So we are growing a little bit faster than the rest of the nation. We just have to see how, the winter plays out, how the pandemic plays out in terms of the recovery. But so there's still a lot of uncertainties there, but if we are going to grow, I think we are all seeing that we're expecting our non-farm employment to reach pre-pandemic levels in the next few years. And that's kind of where I am. In terms of how fast, I'm not quite sure yet, but we do expect that recovery to happen. And so that's what I'm saying.
Okay, so I'm taking a look at audience questions now, and I'm seeing a couple questions about the role of automation and what's been happening during the pandemic and how that might affect employment in the future. I don't know who wants to speak to this, but the question is basically are jobs being lost to automation?
I would, defer to my fellow panelists, but I just wanted to say really quickly, we've been thinking a lot about how automation is going to impact especially low-wage sectors, but it's kind of the dichotomy between, yes, we're going to have automation and this is going to maybe accelerate some of that transition, but also with the labor shortage issue that businesses are reporting. So yes, we're going to have automation, but we're also having a labor shortage because there's just some jobs, there's just some things that the human touch provides that cannot be replaced by a machine. And machines are also very expensive to implement, especially for small businesses. It's just not that easy to just say, okay, we can't find people, let's get a machine in here. It doesn't, I'm not saying that's not going to happen, but that takes a while, that takes a lot of investment. So I think there's going to be certain jobs that are going to be replaced, but there's also opportunities for new jobs to be created in that same arena. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I think so. Samjeet just said it, right? I mean, you can automate, but if you have a robot, there's got to be someone who's going to fix it, right? So it creates a job. I think the important thing to do is, as companies, as we see this automation, is how do we transition low wage jobs or individuals to those jobs, right? And what does that look like? How do we do it? How do we transition to those jobs? That are created by automation.
So the thing I would add is that the research suggests that the employment displacing impacts of automation have traditionally been exaggerated, that there are other jobs that are created. And we don't know, there could be a sort of qualitative leap in artificial intelligence that leads to a lot more ability to replace workers, but so far the evidence is not strong in favor of that, although it is something to be thinking about with regard to the labor shortage and what kinds of jobs can be automated. But one thing I think that would be really important to be asking is, where are the jobs of the future? And they're sometimes not where we think they are. And I'll give you an example. Jobs in home and healthcare are growing more rapidly over the last decade than jobs in high tech. And they're probably going to continue to grow, because while everyone thinks that the big demographic story has to do with the changing ethnicity of California, basically California's demographic change has dramatically slowed down. And if you project forward 30 years, it'll be a little bit more Latino, but not a whole lot more. And every other group, Black Californians will stay about the same share, white Californians will go down a little bit, Asian Californians will go up a little bit. The big demographic story is the aging of the population. Right now, about 13% of the population is above the age of 65. By 2060, about a quarter of the population will be above the age of 65. We're going to need a lot more care workers for the elderly. We're going to need a lot more family leave and support policies for the sandwich generation squeezed between their kids and their parents that they want to be able to take care of. I don't think you can really automate taking care of abuela,
Right.
grandma. You really want someone who loves them, who is skilled, and who is well paid. And as a society, we're going to have to adjust to, how do we grow wages in that sector as that sector grows, because it's not going to be automated and it is going to grow.
Yeah, I just wanted to really quickly say about what Manuel had said about, in-home healthcare workers as being one of the jobs that is going to grow the fastest. That was also one of the jobs that grew fastest post Great Recession as well. And one of the things is that pays about $20,000 a year. So if you're thinking in terms of the distribution of job growth that would happen post Great Recession, and even what we're seeing now, a lot of that growth is in those low wage sectors, which does have impacts on the rest of the economy. So yes, we need in-home healthcare workers to serve our aging population, absolutely. But like Manuel said, how can we make those jobs sustainable and provide a living wage for those who are working in that sector is going to be a big issue, not just for that sector, but all the other sectors that serve them. like the restaurants and all of that.
You know,
So
it's a super crucial and really fundamental issue that we need to own up to as a society. The way I like to encapsulate it is that behind every software engineer is an army of nannies and food service workers and gardeners and all the other services that go hand in hand. So where you see high tech and information services, you also see a lot of these other care services. So we need to figure out as a state, how do we grow those dynamic, what economists call export sectors, meaning that they generate income from outside the region, but understand that they also bring with them a lot of service jobs and food and catering industries, right? And restaurants and everything else. And how do we make sure that those parts of the economy are well supported as well? Because they actually go together. We tend to think about them as being completely separate. Like we can grow biotech without having a lot of biotech engineers who have somebody taking care of their kids. Those two things go together. We need to own up to it.
Great. Another question someone asked, I believe this is in the chat. Will business taxes go up to pay the debt accumulated during the pandemic in the state unemployment insurance fund? And if so, will that slow the recovery? Maybe Somjita, that would be a question for you.
I knew that was going to be a question for me. I don't know the answer to that. I know the state's thinking very heavily, the governor's office is thinking very heavily about what to do about that loan, and considering a lot of different options that are going to, you know, not provide the best benefit for us. I'm not actually sure where we are with that, but that is something that they're thinking about very critically.
Julian, I think you're trying to talk, but you're muted.
And with the chamber, you know, our biggest concern is that, you know, that it not be borne all by business, right? Because, you know, in the past, sometimes that's who has borne the brunt of the bill in past recessions, as we, you know, increase their percentage that they have to pay on unemployment.
Got another person asking, is personal debt slowing the economy? Someone want to try and take a stab at that?
That's actually a great question. If we're talking about personal debt, like credit card debt, we did see a lot of people starting to pay off their credit card debts because they weren't able to spend. We were like stuck at home for months. So one of the things they did was actually kind of, you know, and then they were taking the money that student loans were put on hold and all of this. So that money that they would have spent on student loans got actually, they were using it to pay off some of their non-secured debt, like credit cards and stuff. So in terms of if it's slowing down the economy, it's spending in a sector that doesn't really, we don't see any impact of it. Like when they're paying their mortgages and stuff and it goes to a bank, like the rest of the society, we don't really see the impacts of it. So, but it needs to be done. And so once they're out of that debt, that money can go and be spent in the economy. So maybe right now it just seems like at a level effect, but then once they've paid off that credit card and they don't have to pay those $300 a month or whatever, they have that money to spend. So maybe eventually we'll see some benefits from that.
Another question in the Q&A, this is interesting, thinking especially in terms of, you know, Somjita, you mentioned the smaller labor force we have now. Someone asked, does anyone have ideas regarding how the death rate increasing has impacted the quote unquote labor shortage?
You know, Evan suggested a little bit that the death and sickness rates are important, and this has been an increase in what had been the expected mortality. But I think far more important has been early retirement. Lots of people stepping away from the workforce who probably would have stuck around for a couple of years. But I think both the combination of the economic shock, asking the question which I think a lot of people have asked, which is kind of in a circumstance like this, when you could be, your life could be taken away from you by a random virus. Do you want to, while you're still healthy, do a little bit of that going down your bucket list, a little bit of travel, spending a little bit more time with your grandkids, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's been a real increase in older people stepping away from the labor force who normally would have stuck in for a couple of years further.
One question I saw in the chat, and this was earlier, but it ties to the question of people paying off student loans and also generally how younger people think about their economic future in times of economic shock. Someone asked, are we seeing people are choosing to go to college less and less? And I wonder if anyone can speak to, does anyone have numbers at their fingertips or knowledge of, people making decisions to move towards invest in education versus looking for a new job during this recovery?
So we did see some
It's a-
growth. Sorry,
Go ahead.
thank you. We did see some growth in labor force participation for 16 to 19-year-olds. There were some opportunities for them, especially in the gig economy, delivering for Uber Eats and things like that. So we did see a little bit of growth there. Generally in recessions, we see increases in people going back to school, either for finishing their degrees, getting certificates, and just kind of waiting out the recession instead of having to struggle for jobs. And in this recession, unlike other ones, there are jobs, maybe in a different sector, different areas, different sectors. So I think we are seeing a little bit of growth. I know the community colleges have seen a decline in their enrollment rates, which is not what normally happens, but we are seeing a lot of growth, not a lot of growth, but we are seeing increases in enrollment in the four-year schools. So there might be some, and then also one of the benefits of that is currently it might impact the labor force, but in the next few years, once they graduate, we have a higher educated workforce that improves our economy as well. So, it's a kind of two-way swords, but so right now we are seeing a little bit of those teenagers and normally graduate high school and maybe go to community college. They're opting to do some of the other work that is available for them.
So
Go ahead. I've got something to say too. Go ahead.
No, so just, and this is just here at the chamber, we're seeing a lot of business owners because of, technology and online going back to school to finish their degrees. And we have partnerships with a number of institutions, to encourage that. So we're just like Samjita said, they're seeing an uptick, and we're seeing business owners who, really thought they'd never go back to school, saying, hey, I'm gonna go back to school just, to learn more or to, sharpen my skills. So we're seeing an uptick in entrepreneurs, business owners going back and finishing that degree that maybe they didn't finish years ago.
I was just gonna add that I'm really worried about the decline in community college enrollment. Community college enrollment, those are often immigrant kids, Latino kids, Black kids, less economically well-off kids. And it's really the stepping stone to either four-year or a more viable place in the labor market. And over the last 40 years, the getting a BA has obviously, the premium for that has gone up, but getting an AA has actually held its value over the last 40 years, whereas a high school degree and below, your wage earnings have actually fallen in real terms. So the community college system is the most underrated job development, workforce training component of California. So I think we should be really looking at the community colleges, be worried about that decline, because, if you're 19 years old, skipping going to community college sounds pretty good for this year, but it's going to hurt you at your 30, 31, and 32 in terms of your wage trajectory. So we should be thinking about what incentives we could provide for people to loop back on there.
I agree with the professor. Community colleges are probably our best weapon when we talk about workforce development and using them. And I think, we also have to work with business to, community colleges also develop programs for some of our businesses who are looking for a certain skill in their workforce. So again, I have to agree with the professor that, I still think that community colleges are underutilized. But I think they are one of our best tools that we have in regards to workforce development and skill development here in California.
Great. I'm seeing a question about housing. I know housing affordability is one of the state's biggest challenges. Someone is asking, did housing prices come up? And I believe the answer is a strong yes, but maybe in addition to characterizing that with more nuance, maybe folks could talk about how housing is impacting the challenges for businesses and growth in the economy.
That's actually a great question. Housing prices reached a record high of about $800,000 for 6 months, and then it dipped to less than 800,000 last month to 798,000 for the existing single family median home price in the state. And every single region of California has seen growth in housing prices. And so one of the issues with that is, first, it prices out middle income earners who are not able to afford to buy a home. And then it puts them into the already crowded rental markets, which are normally younger families, people just starting out. And so this just crowds out people in the already the rental markets and stuff. And that is an issue. And, a lot of the discussion at the beginning of the recession was, people are going to flee the state. California is so expensive, but I think it's just a known for us. Like, people know it's an expensive place to do business. It is an expensive place to live, but hopefully the pros outweigh those cons. So what did happen a lot is that people moved out of higher cost areas into lower cost, relative lower costs. If you look at the rest of the country, there is no low cost part of the state, but in terms of, living in Los Angeles versus living in Inland Empire is a little bit cheaper. So people did move around the state to take advantage of slightly lower prices. And then that also affects business decisions about where they're going to locate, because, like Julian mentioned about wildfires, and that's also business location decision, but where your workers are, where your potential customers are, can also be very critical and important decisions for businesses. So housing does play into it. It's not a separate issue for business at all, I think.
Great. I'm wondering if you wanted to chime in here. I know that when we were talking yesterday, you mentioned, some of the commutes your employees have and how that poses a difficulty for them and for you.
Right. And that's just echoing on the wages and people having to move out to afford their housing. And one thing that we did put in place is commuter benefits. I'm trying to just create a culture in our company that supports their commitment to us and their commitment to the clients that we serve. So having, I would say 30% of my workforce commutes. So yeah, which is very hard because it's scary sometimes. If we do have long events or a long work week, I sometimes put them in a hotel closer to the kitchen because I'm afraid that they may fall asleep driving home. I know that's probably not my responsibility, but I do feel responsible for that.
I think you had mentioned yesterday that the commutes can stretch up to like 3 hours or so.
Yeah. 3 to 4. 3 is Vinny is getting home early. It's usually 4. Yeah.
Right. And well, yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, this question kind of came up in our prep too, but how do we get consumers also to pay attention to the conditions of employment benefits and social good being produced by some businesses versus others? Because if you hear about what Rain and Red Door Catering are trying to do in terms of treating their employees decently and being worried, thank you, that they might fall asleep on the way home and be at risk. How do we get, I'm kind of wondering from Rain, as you talk to other businesses, how many are trying to move in this more responsible direction? How do you build alliances with those other businesses? And how do you make consumers aware of, what I might call high road businesses, businesses that are taking a higher road in terms of generating profits, but also prosperity for their workers and benefits for their consumers?
Right, that's a tricky thing because yeah, I don't really know how to communicate and educate our customers and others, and also encourage people to do more if they can. Because people, they go and they see the price of an item at the grocery store and they expect us to be able to carry the same price, but they're not considering all the other elements that go into making just that sandwich, right? So I think it may happen with individuals that are not directly a part of the industry, and like individuals like yourself and other people that are on the panel that encourage not only people to support locally, but why and to support them at a fair wage and not try to get the sweetest discount. We are not a big box, like we can't pass on those savings. But what I can do is guarantee a quality product. So yeah, I don't know. I'm open to suggestion.
So I think Manuel and Rain made some great points. And I think Californians, we are very progressive and we're very forward thinking. So, I know, for example, we recently bought some disposable knives and forks, but made out of avocado seeds because they were better for the environment. And they're more expensive, obviously, but they're better. And so I think in terms of like climate issues and stuff, we're already kind of thinking ahead. So maybe kind of, maybe like a sticker on something that says it's, I don't know, not worker friendly, but something like that, where it's, we see it's sustainable free trade and it's climate friendly, maybe along those lines. This is supportive of Californians' living wages or something. And people will tend to maybe look at that a little bit more. I'm pretty hopeful and optimistic that we do try to look for the greater good as much as we can, and just identifying it, making it easier for people might be also helpful. And maybe like an advertising campaign or something, like I think Buy Local for a few years ago, and maybe in that terms, and I think people would, we just don't always think about that. We always think, oh, we need to get the best, lowest prices, but sometimes those are very abhorrent conditions those things are made in to justify those lower prices. And I think once we start moving towards fairness, I think that's just going to happen for us. I'm very hopeful.
Right.
Julian, did you unmute because you wanted to say something, or should I move to the next question?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. I've got a question from Lenny Mendonca or Lenny Mendonca. I apologize, Lenny, if I'm mispronouncing your name. He asked, what impact do you think the potential passage of Build Back Better budget plans would have on California's economic and employment outlook?
Well, first, shout outs, Lenny. Glad you're listening in. So I think it could have a very important and positive impact on California because of the amount of money that's being put in there with regard to the care economy, and because of the aging of the population that I was talking about. And there's supports there for lifting the wages of care workers and for growing that industry. There's also programs in there for both childcare and universal pre-K, which will deal with some of the challenges with getting people to work. There's two other things that are part of the Building Back Better bill as it's written now. Who knows what will happen as it goes to the Senate, that are key to California. One, the investments in affordable housing. And my gosh, if the state needed affordable housing, that would be California. And the other is the investments in climate resilience. And we, of course, have a lot of climate risks, both with regard to sea level rise, with regard to heat events, and we also are willing to, as a state, move forward on climate investments ourselves. So that may position us to get a larger share of those federal dollars than some states that don't want to deal with climate. So I think the fact that we've been a first mover on that would give us some advantage in bringing those dollars in from the feds, because the feds would be matching a lot of investments. Last thing, there's a lot in there to help with the electrification of the auto industry. And my gosh, are we first mover in that as well?
Great. Well, unless anyone else wants to chime in on that question, I think, as we go into these last 10 minutes or so, one question I wanted to end on is just looking ahead. 2022 is right around the corner. For each of you, what's something that you're optimistic about in 2022, looking forward to, and what's something that you sort of dread? Julian, why don't we start at you, because my eyes flicked to your icon in the screen.
Well, I think hopefully 2022 is a year where we can open up fully. But that's, again, dependent on Californians being vaccinated, right? And us hitting that threshold. And I think a lot of people just don't realize how important being vaccinated is to the economy and keeping it open and us getting past this pandemic. So I'm hopeful that, and looking forward to us being able to meet in person more and more. I don't think Zoom will go away. I think it's still a convenient way as we talk about, how do we impact climate change, less traveling. We can have these calls unless we have to fly down to Los Angeles for the meeting. But, I think 2022 will also see business growth. I'm being optimistic. I think the state has invested in the feds, but especially the state has invested a lot of money into small businesses, I said earlier, whether it was through grant programs, whether it's through funding capital infusion programs to make more dollars available in non-traditional settings, through CDFIs, whatever it may be. And I was ecstatic that, Rain, that you talked about, wanting to buy your building where you're at, because so many businesses of color and diverse businesses oftentimes don't realize they can own their commercial property, right? And I think that is important also to wealth creation, especially in diverse communities that have been lacking. But for so long, we have seen that so many of our diverse businesses, when they went for a loan, they were always small dollar amount loans. I used to ask, why is that? And my people said, they don't get real estate. They're just asking for a bridge loan. So it's good to hear you say that, hey, I'm considering that. And I think that's something we're also going to see with some of our small businesses. They're going to start growing, flourishing, because of the more technical assistance that we're able to give them because of the support from the state and the feds.
Great. Manuel, do you want to offer something that you're optimistic about and something that you are dreading through the next year?
Well, one thing I'm optimistic about is that my musician son's career will be resuscitated venues for him to perform in. And I guess I'm also optimistic about a particular awareness around our mutual responsibilities to one another. I am heartened by the cooperative events and partnerships that Rain was talking about. I'm pleased by those businesses that are realizing how precious the workers they have are and wanting to take care of them. I'm really optimistic about the way the state has realized that if coastal California thrives while inland California sinks, that's not a great way to run a state. So I'm really optimistic about all of that. I'll tell you what I dread, and I realize that this is a 501c3 space, so I'll try to say it carefully. I dread the 2022 midterm elections. I don't know whether you've noticed, but every time Republicans take power, the economy tanks. The current incarnation of the Republican Party does not want to mask or protect people really seriously against the virus. At least, I mean, people will say they want to, you should get vaccinated, but not willing to do a mandate, which actually gives businesses some cover because the businesses aren't responsible for putting out those rules. We would see a retrenchment in the kind of spending and investments we need. So I really actually dread that we could see a return to a kind of anti-science, anti-rational way to approach the deep problems that we've got as a society. I'm pretty pessimistic about November 2022. A lot of people feel like the country is going in the wrong direction. And I think that's in part because we're such an impatient people that we think that now that we've got a new leadership, things should be improved immediately. It's going to take some time to recover from where we've been.
Well, thank you for that comment. And of course, as you mentioned, you know, the moderators of this event are nonpartisan journalists, but panelists are welcome to have their own views.
And boy, do I have them.
Samjita, let's turn to you. What's something you're worried about in the coming year and something you're optimistic about?
Sure. Thank you, Grace. And so I want some things that I'm personally worried about is the inflation being slightly more persistent than transitory for us. We're hoping it's going to subsiding next year. That's a worry. And then, well, as the supply chain issues taking a little bit longer to resolve themselves. And, you know, also worried about the direction of the pandemic. We seem to make some headway and then we hit a variant. So that is a worry because that's going to impact all aspects of our economic growth. And then also one thing I'm optimistic about is that, you know, like I said, our economy, the fundamentals were there. So we are going to see some progress in terms of our recovery as long as we can, you know, keep the virus under control. And then I'm also very optimistic about how, you know, people came together in a very short amount of time. Like we've fundamentally changed our behavior. We started distancing ourselves from people 6 feet. We wore masks when we were inside. And so we very quickly changed our behaviors to protect one another to a large extent. And I think, you know, we can take that cooperative behavior and cooperative outlook and maybe apply it to different things. Maybe we can apply it to supporting sustainable wages for people and buying a little bit higher priced goods. Maybe we can apply it towards climate change. So I'm optimistic that we can all collectively work together to kind of, you know, address some of those large challenges that are facing California.
And then Rain, thought we'd close out with you. What is something you're worried about for your business in the coming year or, you know, your industry more broadly, and what's something that you are optimistic about?
Well, I'm going to start reverse. I'm going to do what
I was trying to end us on a high note, but it's okay. You do it however you want.
Well, oh, that's a good point. But okay, yeah, let's do that. What I'm dreading is that all the messaging, the amplified messaging around equality and racial issues will start to get silent. And people will go back to or the routines that they've created, right? And things won't be resolved, right? That's what I am dreading. What I'm optimistic about is love and legacy. And that is, we're building a campaign of 22 couples in 2022. And for that, besides feeding the community, when we were able to do the weddings of couples this year and last, it brought us so much joy. So I realized that I want to move in that space and continue. I was mostly in corporate, but to stay in that space. And also legacy building, not only for myself and my family, but for my employees, bringing in more workshops and creating the co-op, putting that into place, and having time to practice slow living a little bit, because I've been moving so quickly, just trying to survive and keep the lights open, keep the lights on these last 2 years, that I need to slow down a little bit and practice slow living. So I hope that was high enough as far as I know.
That was great. That was great. Well, thank you so much to all of you panelists for joining us today. I really appreciated you all spending your time and sharing your expertise. Thank you to everyone who joined virtually and listened in. Thank you to our co-hosts, the Milken Institute, and for Cal Matters for letting me do this. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care, folks.
Bye.